Hello, this is Arco Swords, and this is going to be a very quick video to discuss the fact that in antique swords, model years, model numbers, and markings aren't always as simple and straightforward as they might initially seem. In order to demonstrate this, let me present to you the French model of 1845 infantry officer's sabre that's marked having been produced in 1915. You might be wondering how that might work. Did this model of sword survive uninterrupted from 1845 all the way through to World War I? And the answer is no, it didn't. In fact, it was superseded in 1882 by this sword. This is the 1882 French infantry officer's sword, and it is a very different beast to the 1845. Rather than having a brass guard, it has a German silver guard. Note, German silver does not contain actual silver. It also has a backstrap and a straight double-edged blade with offset fullers on either side. It is primarily a thrusting weapon, and it was adopted for all infantry officers from 1882 onwards. So how come an 1845 can be marked as having been produced in 1915? Let's talk about that. This 1845, which is marked having been produced in August of 1915, was produced solely due to the outbreak of World War I. World War I saw a very high turnover rate of officers due to the very low survival rates in the trenches and on the front lines. As a result, some 30,000 of these were produced during World War I at chatellerault. This one in particular is marked Manufacture Nationale d'Armes de Chatellerault, August 1915, for an adjutant of the infantry, and it's a model 1845. So this was produced a very long time after this model was no longer in use, having been officially superseded by the 1882. Let's talk about some of the differences in design which might have led them to produce these instead of more of the 1882s. To begin with, tooling already existed for producing the hilts and the blades for these swords, and it wasn't in use. It was easier to find people to work the tooling than to develop more tooling to make more of the 1882, as machines were very expensive and materials were in short supply. Additionally, this uses a hilt made of a material known as Arco. Arco is a bronze alloy with the addition of carbon, and it patinas to this very recognizable reddish color. The blade is much heavier, as is the hilt, than the 1882. Potentially could be seen as a little bit cruder. This example weighs 970 grams versus the 680 grams that our 1882 weighed. It's also a much stouter blade, less likely to be damaged in trench warfare if anyone were to actually use it, which is rather doubtful. The blade starts at 8mm thick near the tang and is still 4.5mm thick at the beginning of the false edge. The tip is also reinforced and the blade is lightly curved, in contrast to the straight blade of the 1882. Now, I've mentioned that this was produced for World War I. You might be asking, why was anyone still using swords in World War I? But it's true that officers of the time were still issued swords because they were seen not only as a status symbol, but also as a way to inspire courage. An officer using a pistol and a sword must, by necessity, expose themselves more to the enemy than a rifleman has to. This 1845 variant is also shorter than the 1882, which is an indicator of the changing military doctrines in the French army of the time, where the thrust was prioritized over compromised cut and thrust designs or full cut designs, like some cavalry sabres. In the homologation to the thrusting system, we even saw the 1896 replacing curved sabres for cavalry across all branches, light and heavy cavalry included. You can also see that there's a difference in construction in these, with the 1882 prioritizing a metal backstrap and the 1845 using only a simple ribbed carved buffalo horn. This is another example of how this is a more cost-effective sword to produce than this. As this requires less metal in making the guard, it requires less time on expensive machinery and less casting. The blades are also fundamentally different in that this one is nickel coated and this is plain steel. The nickel coating on this example is slightly worse for wear. However, I do have some incredibly pristine examples covered in etching that I'll be showing again in a later video. This 1845 is actually marked with its serial number and inspectors. Not only is it marked with the manufacturer, being Chatellerault, the national manufacturer of arms, it is also marked with J and C inspectors marks on both the hilt and blade, as well as the serial number 49778. I've seen serial numbers for these swords up into 150,000, however I do not believe they were produced consecutively in a single serial range, so you see some with very different numbers. I mentioned before that this is a much heavier sword than the 1882. It is, however, still fairly wieldy. It's well balanced and would be conducive to some rather, let's say, crude fencing techniques, whereas this might seem more refined and better for thrusting schools. This has been a very quick video with a very limited example of how the model number and year on a sword might not necessarily seem to fit with the official order and succession of different sword models. I hope you've enjoyed it, because that's all I've got for you today. Until next time, stay sharp.